North Carolina history, the hidden past of an ancient land. North Carolina, a name that echoes through the mists of time. Nestled along the Atlantic coast, this enigmatic state holds secrets older than the nation itself. It stands as one of the original 13 colonies, bordered by Virginia to the north, Tennessee to the west, South Carolina and Georgia to the south, and to the east, the restless Atlantic Ocean. But beneath its modern face lies a land shaped by water, shadowed by forests, and cloaked in mystery. From the vast marshlands of the coastal tidewater to the rugged peaks of the Appalachian Mountains, North Carolina's terrain has long concealed stories lost to time. Its sweeping landscapes, from sunken swamps to ancient lakes, have fostered not only geographic diversity, but also cultural divisions that stretch back centuries. And at its heart lies Raleigh, a capital city built upon ground walked by countless generations. Long before European ships pierced the horizon, this land was already ancient. The story of North Carolina history begins far earlier than written record, perhaps as early as 8000 BC or before. Here, the Paleo Indians hunted in silence beneath canopies that no longer exist. They were followed by the archaic people, whose lives were carved into the wilderness by the rhythm of the hunt and the changing seasons. Around 1000 BC, a transformation unfolded. The woodland cultures emerged, bringing with them pottery, farming, and sacred mound building, rituals etched into the earth. But it was the rise of the Mississippian peoples, around 800 CE, that left the deepest mark. Their societies were more complex, their leaders more powerful, their temples more immense. Though the soil still holds their stories, time has buried many truths. When Europeans finally arrived, they found a land already claimed, not by kings or crowns, but by powerful indigenous nations. The Tuscarora ruled the coastal plains. The Catawba held sway in the south. And in the mist-shrouded mountains, the Cherokee guarded the western frontier. These were not primitive peoples, but civilizations with deep roots, ancient knowledge, and stories that whispered of spirits, stars, and sacrifice. This is not just history. This is a hidden history of North Carolina, a land of forgotten empires, buried secrets, and the untold legacy of those who came long before. North Carolina history, secrets of proprietary and royal colony. The shadows of North Carolina history deepen in the age of discovery, when maps were blank and the wilderness whispered to those bold enough to enter. It began in 1524, when the Italian navigator Giovanni de Verrazzano sailed the mouth of the Cape Fear River. 16 years later, in 1540, the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto moved through the mist-shrouded western mountains. But neither man stayed. What they glimpsed was a land rich in promise and veiled in danger. Then came Sir Walter Raleigh, armed with a grant from Queen Elizabeth I. In 1584, he dispatched an expedition that returned with tales of fertile lands and limitless opportunity. 1 year later, Raleigh sent settlers to a place called Roanoke Island. He named the colony Virginia, a tribute to the Virgin Queen. But the dream soon soured. The settlers, isolated and undersupplied, began to vanish. First a few, then many. A second group arrived in 1587, led by John Wright, who returned to England for more provisions. Caught in a war between England and Spain, White's return was delayed until 1590. When he finally stepped ashore again, Roanoke was silent. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, only 2 clues carved into trees, Cro and Cro. White sailed to nearby Croton Island, but the settlers had vanished without a trace. What became of the lost colony remains one of the most haunting mysteries in American history, a question echoing through time with no answer. For decades after these failed attempts, the land remained under native control. Then, in 1629, a grant by King Charles I introduced a new name, Carolina. Yet even then, no settlements took hold. Until the 1650s, when settlers from Virginia drifted south into the Albemarle Sound region. The tide was turning. In 1663, King Charles II formalized the colony, granting it to 8 lords proprietors. But control from across the sea was weak, and the settlers resisted. Government was imposed from Charleston, far to the south, while North Carolina was left in a political fog. From 1712 to 1729, the area was governed by deputies from Charleston, until eventually the British Crown seized direct control. The boundaries between North Carolina and South Carolina were first agreed upon in 1735, but the final lines would not be drawn until nearly a century later in 1821. North Carolina's growth was anything but smooth. Virginia restricted its tobacco shipments. Clashes with absentee rulers led to rebellion. The Tuscarora War, 1711-13, erupted in bloodshed and betrayal. Meanwhile, the coast was stalked by pirates like Blackbeard, who haunted its waters and held entire towns hostage to fear. Unlike other colonies that flourished around bustling ports, North Carolina was slow to urbanize. No true town existed until Bath was incorporated in 1705, a solitary on a wild, unforgiving landscape. Only by 1729, when royal control replaced failing proprietary rule, did more towns begin to appear. But even then, much of North Carolina's history remained hidden in dense forests, in half-buried ruins, and in the wind that whispered through its pine-covered hills. This is not just a story of colonization. It is a tale of a land that resisted taming, a colony shaped as much by absence as presence, a chapter in American history steeped in shadow and still echoing with unanswered questions. North Carolina history, rebellion, revolution, and the rise of a state. The tide shifted in North Carolina history during the years of royal rule. What had once been a scattered, fragile colony began to transform. Population surged. Settlements crept westward into the Piedmont. Wealth, fueled by tobacco, rice, and the pine-rich naval stores, began to flow. But beneath the surface of prosperity, unrest brewed. An agricultural empire was taking shape, built on the backs of an ever-growing enslaved population. Tobacco fields stretched to the horizon. Forests were stripped for pitch, tar, and timber, vital for the ships of empire. Yet with wealth came inequality, and with growth came fracture. In the years leading up to the American Revolution, a bitter tension grew between the colony's eastern elite and its western settlers. By 1768, those in the backcountry had had enough. Calling themselves the regulators, they rose up in defiance of unjust taxation and corrupt governance. The colonial militia crushed them, forcing many to flee the colony entirely, but the embers of rebellion were already glowing. Then, in 1775, the royal governor fled. And just like that, North Carolina cast off its chains. The colony aligned itself with the rising cause of independence. 3 North Carolinians would go on to sign the Declaration of Independence, sealing their place in history. The Revolutionary War tore through the region. North Carolinians battled not only the British Army, but also the Cherokee Nation, who had allied with the Crown. Blood was spilled across the frontier. In 1780, American patriots scored a stunning victory at Kings Mountain, just across the South Carolina border. But the following year, they suffered a costly defeat at Guilford Courthouse, a battle so fierce it weakened the British forces beyond recovery. In 1776, amid the flames of war, North Carolina adopted its first state constitution. It was a cautious, conservative document. Only property owners could vote. Only Protestants could hold office. The executive branch held little power. And yet, it was a first step towards something lasting. By 1790, the state's western lands were ceded to the federal government, territory that would soon become the state of Tennessee. In 1794, a permanent capital was established, Raleigh, a city born not from commerce or geography, but from deliberate state planning. But after the war, North Carolina entered a strange period of dormancy. For decades, the government did little. Taxes remained low, and public services were minimal. The state seemed to slumber while others around it stirred. Then, in 1835, a new constitutional convention rewrote the rules. The governor and legislature were granted more power. Voting restrictions were eased, though only for white men. Slowly, the machinery of state began to move. By the 1840s and 1850s, change was undeniable. A statewide school system emerged. Roads, railroads, and canals were planned and funded. North Carolina was awakening. And for the first time, it was beginning to build itself for its people, not just the few who held power. But even as progress stirred, deeper currents still flowed beneath the surface. Currents that would soon drag the state toward a new and devastating conflict. North Carolina history. Civil War shadows and the long road through Reconstruction. When the storm of Civil War swept across America, North Carolina stood at a crossroads, not eager, not rash, but reluctant. Unlike its southern neighbor South Carolina, whose fiery pro-slavery rhetoric led the charge into secession, North Carolina hesitated. Even as tensions rose, it searched for compromise. But when President Abraham Lincoln called for troops to suppress the rebellion, that hope shattered. Only then, and only then, did North Carolina cast its lot with the Confederacy. Thousands of North Carolinians took up arms, fighting for a cause wrapped in complex loyalties. But the bloodshed mostly happened elsewhere. North Carolina, for most of the war, remained a quiet stage until the end, when General William Tecumseh Sherman swept through its heart with fire and fury, leading the Union Army into the state in the final act of the war. In 1865, as the guns fell silent, North Carolina ratified the 13th Amendment, officially ending slavery. But the end of chains did not mean the beginning of freedom. White authorities scrambled to reinvent control. Across the South, including North Carolina, new systems of oppression were built from the ashes of the old. In 1867, Congress took command. Reconstruction began, not just as policy, but as a battle for the soul of the South. The Republican Party, infused with the hopes of freedmen, dominated the 1868 Constitutional Convention. A new government rose, one that promised protection for African Americans. That same year, North Carolina was readmitted to the Union, but the promise of equality was met with ruthless resistance. White Democrats, unwilling to share power, turned to terror. Under cover of night, the Ku Klux Klan unleashed a wave of fear and bloodshed. Their goal, to dismantle the new order before it could take root. By 1872, the Democrats had reclaimed control. The progress of Reconstruction was reversed. Services were slashed. Schools and hospitals were left to wither. For decades, North Carolina's people, especially African Americans, were denied even the most basic public support. In the 1890s, a coalition of populists rose to challenge the system. For a brief moment, it seemed change might come again, but it faded as quickly as it appeared. Then in 1900, the curtain fell. A new set of constitutional amendments effectively disenfranchised nearly all black voters. White supremacy became law, and North Carolina entered the 20th century carrying the weight of silenced voices and shattered hopes. Yet even in this era of oppression, the land itself began to shift. In the late 19th century, the state's economy changed course. Textile mills spread across the Piedmont, churning cotton into cloth. In Winston-Salem, a machine that could roll cigarettes faster than any hand sparked a revolution. Tobacco transformed the region, and factories rose like monuments to a new industrial age. Then, on a windswept strip of sand near Roanoke Island, two brothers prepared to defy gravity. In 1903, Wilbur and Orville Wright launched the first power flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. For the first time in history, humankind left the ground behind. North Carolina had stepped into the sky. From war-torn soil to smoke-filled factories, from crushed revolts to whispered dreams of flight. This chapter in North Carolina history is one of resistance, of transformation, and of contradictions that still echo today. North Carolina history, from war-torn past a modern powerhouse. As the 20th century dawned, North Carolina stood on the edge of transformation. The shadows of the Civil War still lingered, but the state was now swept into the greater rhythms of a rapidly changing nation. World War I brought a brief surge of development, economic growth, social change, and a taste of modernity. But the prosperity would not last. When the Great Depression struck in the 1930s, North Carolina was not spared. Schools emptied. Public services collapsed. Fields lay fallow. Yet even in this darkness, light flickered. Under Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, the federal government stepped in. Relief came slowly, but surely. Farmers were offered price supports. Jobs returned through national programs. And for the first time, the hand of Washington reached deep into the rural South. Then came World War II, and with it, revival. North Carolina became a strategic nerve center. Military installations rose across the state, none more iconic than Fort Bragg in Fayetteville. Factories churn out weapons, uniforms, and supplies. By war's end, North Carolina had delivered more textiles to the military than any other state. The engines of war had rekindled the economy and set the stage for something new. Post-war North Carolina was no longer a quiet, rural state on the eastern fringe. It was becoming something bigger. Highways carved paths into the interior. Cities like Charlotte, Raleigh, and Durham surged with new industries and new people. The Research Triangle became a symbol of scientific innovation. Banking, technology, and research joined traditional manufacturing, creating a diversified economy that would become one of the strongest in the nation. As the economy grew, so did the political landscape. By the 1970s, the state rediscovered the power of two-party politics. After nearly a century of Democratic dominance, a Republican governor took office in 1973, followed by another from 1985 to 1993. The state had become competitive, not only in business but in ideas. Yet, progress came at a cost. The long, painful dismantling of racial segregation consumed the middle of the century. From a quiet defiance of Greensboro's lunch counters in 1960 to the court battles over public schools in the 1950s and 60s, the people of North Carolina waged an exhausting war against the legacies of Jim Crow. By the 1970s, legal segregation had ended, but its echoes remained. Even into the 21st century, North Carolina continued to confront the ghosts of its past, in education, in opportunity, and in the deep-rooted scars of injustice. The challenge now is not rebellion, but resolution. Not revolution, but inclusion. North Carolina's history is not just one of struggle. It is one of reinvention. From colonial outpost to Confederate stronghold, from industrial hub to modern research capital, it has been shaped by fire, by failure, and by the unyielding pursuit of something better. And the story is far from over. If you found this journey through North Carolina history as powerful and mysterious as we did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to History Love. Dive deeper with us into the untold stories, forgotten battles, and hidden truths that shaped America. Your history deserves to be remembered. Stay curious. Stay inspired. Only on History Love.